This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin our investigation, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the winter of 1899, a house stood at the end of Blanchard Road in the township of Sebec, Piscataquis County, Maine. It was the kind of house that seemed to grow out of the frozen earth itself, a sprawling, connected farmstead built in the old New England way. Big house to little house, back house to barn, all joined together in one continuous structure that stretched nearly 200 feet from the road to where the forest began its impenetrable wall of white pine and spruce. The locals had a name for the property. They called it Old Wood, not because of the trees that surrounded it, though those were ancient enough. Just a quick reminder, you are listening to this story on the channel The Fear Behind You. If you are hearing this from any other channel, please be aware that this video has been copied and reposted without my authorization. In that case, I kindly ask you to report it. Thank you for supporting original content. They called it that because the house had been built from the salvaged timbers of 3 older structures, each one carrying its own history, each one contributing its own grain to the walls that now held the lives of the Crenshaw family within. When I first began looking into this case in 1952, I expected to find the usual story of rural hardship and family collapse that so often mark these isolated Maine settlements. What I found instead was something that still troubles me, even now, as I reconstruct these events, because the story of Old Wood is not merely a story of what happened to the Crenshaws. It is a story of what happens when a house begins to know more about its inhabitants than they know about themselves. The Crenshaws arrived in Sebec in the spring of 1887. Phineas Crenshaw was 43 years old, a former scaler who had worked the lumber camps along the Piscataquis River for nearly 2 decades. His wife, Cordelia, was 38, the daughter of a Bangor shipwright who had taught her to read wood the way other women read scripture. They came with a small inheritance from Cordelia's deceased father, enough to purchase the Old Wood property from a Dover merchant who had held it for tax purposes for nearly 6 years. No one in the township could remember the last time anyone had lived there. Some said it had stood empty since before the war. Others claimed they had seen lamplight in the windows as recently as the previous winter, though no one could agree on which windows or for how many nights. The house they found was in remarkable condition for a structure that had supposedly been abandoned for so long. The floors were sound, the roof held tight. The great center chimney, which served fireplaces in both the big house and the little house, drew smoke as cleanly as if it had been swept the week before. Cordelia noted this in a letter to her sister in Brunswick, a letter I discovered among a collection of family papers donated to the Maine Historical Society in 1934. She wrote that the house seemed to have been waiting for them. She wrote that it felt like coming home to a place she had never been. Phineas set about the work of turning the property back into a functioning farm. The land had been cleared generations before, and though the forest was creeping back along the edges, there were still 40 acres of usable pasture and another 12 of what might become tillable soil once the stones were picked and the stumps were pulled. He purchased a pair of draft horses from a farmer in Guilford and began the slow work of restoration. Cordelia managed the household, organizing the back house for storage and workshop use, setting up the little house kitchen with the efficiency of someone who understood that winter in Piscataquis County was not to be taken lightly. By the time the first snow fell in November of 1887, they had made the place their own. The barn held 4 cows, a dozen chickens, and a breeding pair of pigs. The root cellar was stocked with potatoes, turnips, carrots, and the last of the season's apples. Cordelia had pickled enough cabbage and preserved enough berry jam to see them through to spring. Phineas had cut and stacked 8 cords of firewood, enough to keep the stoves and fireplaces burning through even the harshest January nights. They were, by all appearances, a couple who had found their place in the world. But there was something about that first winter that neither of them mentioned in their letters, something I only discovered when I spoke with a descendant of their nearest neighbor, a man named Hosea Peavy, who had farmed a piece of land about a mile up the road toward Dover Foxcroft. According to family stories passed down through 3 generations, Hosea had visited the Crenshaws several times during that first winter, bringing news from town and checking to make sure they had weathered the worst of the storms. Each time, he reported to his wife that there was something strange about the house. He could never quite explain what he meant. The house was warm, he said. The house was always too warm. Even on nights when the temperature dropped below 0 and the wind came screaming down from Katahdin, the Crenshaw's house seemed to hold heat in a way that defied explanation. Phineas attributed this to the quality of the construction. The connected buildings formed a kind of windbreak, he said, and the great mass of the chimney held heat like a stone battery. But Hosea was not convinced. He had lived in Maine all his life. He had seen every kind of farmhouse the region had to offer, and he had never encountered one that felt quite like old wood. It was not just warm, he told his wife. It was warm in the wrong places. The cellar, for instance, should have been the coldest part of the house in winter, a place where ice formed on the walls and breath hung visible in the air. But the Crenshaw's cellar was mild, almost comfortable. Hosea had gone down there once to help Phineas retrieve a barrel of salt pork, and he had noticed something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. The walls were sweating, not with ice, with something like condensation, as if the stone foundation itself were breathing out moisture in slow, rhythmic pulses. I mention this detail because it becomes important later, much later. The first years of the Crenshaw's occupation of old wood passed without notable incident. They were not social people by nature, but they were not recluses either. Cordelia attended services at the Congregational Church in Dover whenever the roads were passable, and Phineas made regular trips to the general store in Sebec Village for supplies. They were known as quiet, hard-working, and honest, 3 qualities that guaranteed a certain level of respect in the rural Maine of that era. If they kept to themselves more than their neighbors might have liked, well, that was their business. The winters were long, and people had enough to worry about without concerning themselves with the private affairs of others. It was in the spring of 1892 that things began to change. I should explain something about the geography of old wood before I continue. The property sat in a shallow depression between 2 low ridges, a natural bowl that collected cold air in winter and held moisture in summer. The Piscataquis River lay about 4 miles to the south, beyond a thick band of forest that had never been fully cleared. To the north, the land rose gradually toward the slate quarries of Monson and the wild country beyond. The road that connected the property to Sebec Village ran east along the southern ridge, climbing gradually before descending into the river valley. It was not an easy road in any season, but it was passable most of the year, except during the spring thaw, when the lower sections became impassable mud, and during the worst winter storms when snow could drift 10 feet deep in the exposed stretches. In March of 1892, a surveyor from the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad passed through the area, mapping potential routes for a spur line that would connect the timber regions north of Moosehead Lake to the main rail network. His name was Aldous Fenwick, and he kept detailed notes of his travels, notes that were later deposited in the archives of the Maine State Library. I spent 3 days reading through those notes in 1954, looking for any mention of the Crenshaw property. What I found was brief but troubling. Fenwick wrote that he had stopped at a farmhouse on Blanchard Road to ask for directions to the town line. The house, he noted, was of the connected type common to the region, though unusually long and low in its proportions. The woman who answered his knock was polite but distracted. She kept glancing back into the house as if listening for something. When he asked about the road conditions ahead, she answered vaguely, her words trailing off into silence before she completed her thoughts. The man of the house was nowhere to be seen, though Fenwick could hear sounds from somewhere in the back of the structure, sounds he described as rhythmic tapping, like someone working with a small hammer on a piece of wood. What struck Fenwick most, however, was the temperature inside the house. He had been invited in briefly to warm himself by the fire, and he found the interior oppressively hot, far hotter than any house he had entered in his months of traveling through the Maine woods. The fire in the kitchen stove was burning low, he noted, barely enough to heat a kettle, yet the air in the room was thick and close, almost humid, as if the walls themselves were radiating warmth. He did not stay long, he could not explain why, but he felt a pressing need to leave, a sensation he described in his notes as a sudden and irrational certainty that he was not wanted there. Not unwelcome, not wanted. There was a difference, he wrote, though he could not articulate what that difference might be. I found Fenwick's observation interesting because it matched so closely what Hosea Peavy had noticed years earlier. Two independent witnesses, separated by 5 years and unknown to each other, both describing the same anomalous warmth, both describing the same vague sense of unease, and both failing to find any explanation for what they experienced. The tapping sounds that Fenwick heard are harder to explain. According to town records, Phineas Crenshaw was not engaged in any regular trade or craft during this period. He farmed his land, kept his animals, and occasionally took seasonal work at one of the lumber mills in Guilford when money was short. He was not a carpenter, not a cooper, not a blacksmith. There was no obvious reason for him to be making the kind of sounds that Fenwick described. Yet the sounds continued. Other visitors to the property over the following years reported similar experiences. Sometimes the tapping seemed to come from the cellar, sometimes from somewhere deep in the connected passage between the little house and the back house. Once, according to a letter written by a traveling minister who stopped at the farm in the summer of 1894, the sound seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if something were moving through the spaces between the boards. The minister, whose name was Reverend Obadiah Marsh, wrote to his brother in Portland that he had conducted a brief prayer service for Mrs. Crenshaw, who had requested spiritual guidance regarding a matter she would not specify. During the service, he noticed that her husband remained in another part of the house and that the tapping continued throughout, soft but persistent, like a heartbeat heard through a stethoscope. When he asked about the sound, Cordelia smiled and said only that the house had its ways. He did not understand what she meant. He asked if her husband was working on some project. She said that her husband was resting. He asked who then was making the sound. She did not answer. She only smiled again, that same strange smile, and offered him more tea. Reverend Marsh did not return to the Crenshaw property. He noted in his letter that he had felt, during the prayer service, a distinct impression that he was being watched, not by Mrs. Crenshaw, who kept her eyes closed throughout, not by any visible presence, but watched nonetheless, observed, and evaluated by something that existed just beyond the edge of his perception. He attributed this feeling to nerves and to the general eeriness of the isolated location. But he also noted that he had been conducting services in rural Maine for 30 years, and he had never before felt anything quite like what he experienced at Old Wood. By 1895, the Crenshaws had largely withdrawn from local society. Cordelia no longer attended church. Phineas no longer made his regular trips to the general store, instead sending written lists with a hired man who came down from Guilford twice a month to help with the heavier farm work. This hired man, whose name was Zebediah Stoke, was one of the few people who had regular access to the property during this period. His testimony, recorded in a deposition given to the Piscataquis County Sheriff's Office in 1903, provides our most detailed account of what life was like at Old Wood in the years before the events of 1899. Stoke described a household that was functional but strange. The Crenshaws treated each other with courtesy, but without warmth. They rarely spoke in his presence, communicating instead through glances and small gestures that suggested a long practice of silence. The house itself was immaculately maintained, every surface clean, every tool in its proper place, every animal fed and watered on schedule. Yet there was something about the atmosphere that made Stoke uneasy. He described it as a feeling of weight, as if the air inside the connected buildings carried a pressure that the air outside did not. He said that he always felt relieved when his work was done and he could step back out into the open, even on the coldest winter days. The tapping sounds continued during Stoke's visits, though they seemed to occur less frequently when he was present. He asked Phineas about them once, and received only a brief shake of the head in response. He asked Cordelia, and she said something that he never forgot. She said that the house was talking to itself. She said it had been doing so for years. She said they had learned to listen. When he pressed her for an explanation, she refused to elaborate. But she did tell him one thing more. She said that the cellar was no longer safe. She said that no one was to go down there anymore, for any reason. When he asked why, she simply shook her head and walked away. Stoke's deposition also mentions something that I found particularly significant in light of later events. He said that during his final visit to the property in October of 1898, he noticed that portions of the wall in the back house had been recently disturbed. The boards had been removed and then replaced, but not quite aligned with the original construction. When he asked about this, Phineas told him that they had been making repairs, but Stoke had been a carpenter's assistant in his youth and he knew repair work when he saw it. This was not repair work. This was something else. The boards had been opened and then closed again, as if someone had needed access to the space inside the wall, and had then sealed that space back up. What was in that space, Stoke could not say. He did not ask, and the Crenshaws did not volunteer any information. But he noted that the disturbed section of wall was located directly above the cellar stairs in the narrow passage that connected the little house to the back house. And he noted that the tapping sounds, when they occurred during his visit, seemed to come from precisely that location. The winter of 1898-1899 was one of the harshest in Maine history. The first major snowfall came in late November, dropping nearly 3 feet of snow in a single night. By December, the accumulation was already above average, and temperatures remained consistently below zero for weeks at a time. The roads became impassable. Farms were cut off from their neighbors. People who had not adequately prepared found themselves facing the prospect of starvation before spring. The Crenshaws were not among those who had failed to prepare. According to Stoke's final inventory, conducted in October, the property had sufficient provisions to last through even a prolonged winter. The barn was full of hay. The root cellar, which Cordelia still insisted no one enter, was supposedly stocked with preserved foods. The woodshed contained at least 10 cords of seasoned hardwood. There was no reason to think that the Crenshaws would face any particular difficulty during the coming months. Yet something changed during that winter, something that no one outside the property could have known about at the time, but which became apparent when the spring thaw finally arrived and the roads became passable again. Hosea Peavy was the first to visit Oldwood after the snow melted. He had not seen the Crenshaws since before the first November storm, and he was concerned about their welfare. When he arrived at the property on the morning of April 3, 1899, he found the house closed and silent. No smoke rose from any of the chimneys. No animals moved in the barn. The front door, which faced the road, was latched from the inside. He walked around to the dooryard and found the kitchen door in the little house, standing open, banging gently in the spring wind. He called out but received no answer. He entered the house. What he found inside has been described in various accounts over the years, some of them accurate, some of them wildly embellished. I will attempt to reconstruct the scene as faithfully as possible, based on Peavy's original statement to the sheriff's office and the subsequent investigation conducted by Deputy Ezra Pillsbury of the Piscataquis County Sheriff's Department. The little house kitchen was clean but cold. The stove had been allowed to go out, and ice had formed on the water in the sink. The table was set for two with plates and utensils laid out, as if for a meal that had never been served. There was food in the pantry, still frozen solid from the winter cold that had penetrated the house once the fires died. The floor was clean, the windows were intact. There was no sign of violence or struggle. Peavy moved through the connecting passage toward the big house, calling out as he went. The passage was dark, the small windows along its length covered with frost that had not yet melted. He noticed that the walls felt strange to the touch, not cold as he would have expected, but somehow colder than cold, as if the wood itself had absorbed something deeper than mere temperature. He did not like the feeling. He did not like the silence, but he continued. The big house parlor was empty. So was the formal dining room, the front bedroom, the back bedroom. Every room was clean, orderly, and abandoned. The beds were made. The furniture was arranged. Personal items sat on dressers and shelves, untouched and unremarkable. It was as if the Crenshaws had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routine, leaving everything behind exactly as it was. Peavy searched the back house next. The carriage bay was empty. The Crenshaws had sold their wagon the previous summer and had not replaced it. The workshop area contained the expected tools and supplies, arranged neatly on benches and hooks. The privy, accessed through a small door at the far end, was clean and unused. The barn, when he finally forced his way through the frozen door, contained nothing but the bones of animals. The cows had died first, probably within weeks of the first winter storm. They lay in their stalls, reduced to hide and skeleton, their flesh consumed by something that had left no trace. The pigs were similarly reduced. The chickens had not even left bones. Only feathers remained, scattered across the floor of their coop like a thin layer of snow. Whatever had killed the animals, it had been thorough. It had been patient, and it had left nothing behind that could be eaten by anything else. Peavy did not go down to the cellar. He remembered what Stoke had told him about Cordelia's warning, and even though he could not have explained why, he felt that the warning still applied. Instead, he left the house and walked back to his own farm, where he wrote a message to be carried into Dover Foxcroft by his eldest son. The message was simple. It said that something had happened at Old Wood and that the sheriff should come as soon as possible. Deputy Pillsbury arrived 3 days later, accompanied by a doctor from Milo and 2 men from the town office who had been deputized for the occasion. They conducted a thorough search of the property, documenting their findings in a report that was filed with the county records office in April of 1899, and that I obtained a copy of in 1953. The report confirmed everything Peavy had described. The house was empty. The animals were deceased. The Crenshaws were nowhere to be found. But the report also contained details that Peavy had not noticed or had not mentioned. Details that suggested something far stranger than a simple abandonment. First, the cellar. Despite Cordelia's warning, Pillsbury felt it was necessary to search every part of the property. He descended the stairs with a lantern and found a space that defied his expectations. The cellar was not cold. Even in April, with the house unheated for months, the cellar was warm, not merely temperate, warm, as if fires still burned somewhere in the depths of the foundation. The walls, as Hosea Peavy had noticed years earlier, were covered with condensation. The floor was damp, and there were marks in the dirt. Pillsbury described the marks as tracks, though he acknowledged that they did not resemble any tracks he had ever seen. They were long and narrow, almost like the trails left by snakes, but much wider and deeper, as if something of considerable weight had been dragging itself across the cellar floor. The tracks originated at the base of the stairs and proceeded towards the far wall of the cellar, where they disappeared into the foundation itself. There was no opening in the wall that Pillsbury could see. The stones were fitted tightly together, mortared in place decades or perhaps centuries before. Yet the tracks led directly to that wall and then simply stopped. Second, the walls of the back house passage. Pillsbury noticed the same disturbed boards that Stoke had mentioned in his deposition. He had the men pry them open to examine the space within. What they found was described in the report as a cavity of unusual dimensions, extending much deeper into the wall than standard construction would allow. The cavity appeared to have been deliberately created, the interior boards removed and the space between the outer and inner walls hollowed out to a depth of nearly 2 feet. The interior surfaces of the cavity were smooth, worn smooth, as if by repeated contact over a long period of time, and there were scratches in the wood, fine parallel lines that suggested the marks of fingernails. Third, the personal effects. Among the items left behind were several journals kept by Cordelia Crenshaw, documenting her daily life at Oldwood from 1887 to late 1898. The final entries, written in November and early December of that year, described a series of events that shed new light on what might have happened during that fatal winter. According to Cordelia's journal, the problems began in the autumn of 1898, shortly after Stoke's final visit. She wrote that Phineas had been spending increasing amounts of time in the cellar, despite her repeated warnings that he should stay away from that part of the house. He would go down in the evening, she wrote, and not return until morning. When she asked what he was doing, he would not answer. When she tried to follow him, he locked the cellar door behind him and refused to let her in. She wrote that she could hear him talking down there, talking to someone or something that was not visible, when he finally emerged. She wrote that his voice changed when he was in the cellar, becoming deeper, slower, as if he were speaking a language that his throat was not designed to produce. She wrote that sometimes she could hear another voice answering him, a voice that came from the walls themselves, from the wood and stone and darkness that made up the foundation of their home. By November, Cordelia was afraid. She wrote that Phineas no longer seemed like himself. He moved differently, she said. He held his body at odd angles, as if he were compensating for a shape that did not quite fit inside his skin. His eyes had changed. She could not explain how, but they had changed. When he looked at her, she felt that he was seeing something other than what was actually there. The final entry in the journal was dated December 2nd, 1898. It was brief, only a few lines. Cordelia wrote that Phineas had told her the house was ready. She wrote that he had opened the wall in the passage, the one above the cellar stairs, and shown her what was inside. She did not describe what she saw. She only wrote that she understood now. She wrote that she had always been meant to understand. She wrote that the house had been waiting for her since the day she was born. There was no entry for December 3rd or any day after. The investigation concluded without resolution. The Crenshaws were never found. No evidence of their departure from the property was ever discovered. No bodies, no trace of their passage through the snow, no record of their arrival anywhere else. The official determination was that they had perished during the winter, their remains somehow lost to weather and wildlife before the spring thaw allowed for a proper search. The property was seized for unpaid taxes in 1901 and sold at auction to a timber company that planned to harvest the surrounding forest. The house itself was never occupied again. But the story did not end there. In 1923, a crew of loggers working the parcel adjacent to the old wood property reported a series of unusual experiences. They said that on certain nights, when the wind was still and the temperature dropped below zero, they could hear sounds coming from the direction of the old Crenshaw farm. Tapping sounds, they said. Rhythmic and persistent, like someone working with a small hammer deep underground. When they investigated, they found the house still standing, though badly deteriorated, its windows broken and its doors hanging open. They did not enter. One of the crew, a man named Hiram Goodspeed, said later that he had approached the building and felt something that stopped him in his tracks. He described it as a pressure, an invisible force pushing against his chest, warning him to come no further. He turned around and walked away, and he never returned to that part of the forest. In 1947, a fire of unknown origin destroyed most of the old wood structures. By the time firefighters arrived from Dover-Foxcroft, only the foundation remained, a great rectangle of blackened stone sinking slowly into the earth. The cellar, when investigators finally descended to examine it, was found to be filled with ash and debris. But beneath the debris they found something that had not been there in 1899. They found bones, not human bones, not animal bones, something else entirely. The state coroner who examined the remains could not identify their origin. The bones were too large to belong to any creature native to Maine, and their structure did not match any known species in the scientific record. They were hollow, like the bones of birds, but thick-walled and dense, capable of supporting enormous weight. They were arranged in a pattern that suggested a skeletal system unlike any the coroner had ever studied, with joints that allowed for movement in directions that mammalian anatomy did not permit. The bones were photographed, catalogued, and sent to the University of Maine for further analysis. They arrived at the university on October 15, 1947. On October 16th, the building housing the biology department suffered an electrical fire that destroyed, among other things, all the materials related to the old wood remains. The photographs were lost. The bones were reduced to powder. The report that the coroner had begun writing was never completed. I found a reference to this incident in a 1949 newspaper clipping buried in a collection of miscellaneous materials at the Bangor Public Library. It was brief, only a few lines, noting that the university had suffered a minor fire with no injuries and limited damage. There was no mention of the old wood remains. There was no mention of what they might have represented. When I attempted to contact the coroner who had examined the bones, I was told that he had died in 1948 under circumstances that were described only as unexpected. His files had been transferred to a successor who had no knowledge of the old wood case. His personal papers had been claimed by family members who declined to speak with me. Everything that might have shed light on what was found in that cellar had, apparently, ceased to exist. I spent 3 more years investigating the Crenshaw case before finally setting the project aside in 1956. By then I had accumulated a thick file of testimonies, documents, and circumstantial evidence, but no clear conclusion. I could not explain what had happened to Phineas and Cordelia Crenshaw. I could not explain the sounds that multiple witnesses reported hearing over a period of more than a decade. I could not explain the warmth in the cellar, or the marks in the dirt, or the cavity in the wall, or the scratches that suggested fingernails dragging against wood. I certainly could not explain the bones. What I can say is this. The house known as Old Wood was built from salvaged timbers taken from older structures that had their own histories and their own secrets. The land on which it stood had been occupied for longer than any record could trace, by people whose names and purposes are lost to time. And whatever came to live in that house, whether it was drawn there by the materials from which it was constructed, or by the isolation of the location, or by something in the Crenshaws themselves, it was patient. It was very, very patient. The tapping sounds that witnesses reported over the years have been interpreted in many ways. Some have suggested that they were made by animals nesting in the walls. Others have proposed that they were caused by thermal expansion of the wood, the natural settling of an old structure, adjusting to changes in temperature. But these explanations do not account for the rhythm that witnesses consistently described. They do not account for the sense that the sounds were not random, but deliberate, that they were not noise, but communication. Cordelia Crenshaw wrote in her journal that the house was talking to itself. She wrote that she and her husband had learned to listen. I believe that whatever was making those sounds, whether from inside the walls or from somewhere deeper in the structure, was indeed trying to communicate. And I believe that the Crenshaws, over the course of their years at Old Wood, came to understand what it was saying. What it told them, I cannot know. What they learned in their conversations with the darkness, I cannot guess. But I suspect that the cold air that several witnesses described, the air that seemed to breathe from the cellar and the walls, was not simply a meteorological anomaly. I suspect that it was something else entirely, something that moved through spaces too small for human passage, something that watched and waited and eventually acted. There is a phrase that has stayed with me throughout my investigation, a phrase that Cordelia used in her final journal entry. She wrote that the house had been waiting for her since the day she was born. I have thought about those words many times over the years. I have wondered what they might mean, and I have wondered if, somewhere in the forests of Piscataquis County, on land that was once called Old Wood, something is still waiting. The site of the Crenshaw farm is now part of a commercial timber operation. The forest has long since reclaimed the cleared land, and nothing remains of the original structures except a few scattered stones that might once have been part of a foundation. The road that led to the property has been abandoned, its roots slowly being erased by weather and undergrowth. In another generation, there will be no visible trace that anyone ever lived there at all. But I spoke with a surveyor in 1961 who had been mapping timber stands in that area. He told me that there was one section of the forest that his crews would not enter, a shallow depression between two low ridges where the trees grew strangely close together and the ground remained damp even in the driest summers. He said that on his single visit to that location, he had heard something that made him turn around and walk away. A sound, he said, a rhythmic sound, like tapping. He asked if I knew anything about the history of that land. I told him what I knew. He said he wished I had not. The case of the Crenshaw family and the house called Old Wood remains officially unsolved. No bodies were ever recovered. No crime was ever charged. The property records list the Crenshaws as having vacated in late 1898, their fate unknown, their whereabouts never determined. The file sits in the archives of the Piscataquis County Sheriff's Office, gathering dust alongside hundreds of other files documenting the disappeared and forgotten of rural Maine. But I do not think Phineas and Cordelia Crenshaw left Old Wood. I think they found what they were looking for when they purchased that property in 1887. I think they spent 12 years learning its language, understanding its needs, and preparing themselves for whatever transformation it offered. And I think that when the winter of 1898-1899 sealed them inside those connected buildings, with no witnesses and no interference, they finally completed their education. The bones found in the cellar in 1947 were not human. But I do not believe they belonged to whatever lived in that house before the Crenshaws arrived. I believe they were what the Crenshaws became. The cold air that breathed from those walls, the warmth that defied the winter, the tapping that echoed through generations, these were not accidents of construction or climate. They were signs of something that had made its home in Old Wood long before any family claimed the deed. Something that found in Phineas and Cordelia Crenshaw the companions it had been seeking. Something that, even now, may be listening for the next visitors to stumble across its domain. When I finished my investigation in 1956, I filed my notes and photographs with the Maine Historical Society, where they remain available to any researcher who cares to examine them. I hoped that someone might someday pick up where I left off, might find the answers that eluded me. But in the decades since, no one has. The case has faded from memory, as so many mysteries do, replaced by newer puzzles and fresher horrors. Yet there are nights, even now, when I wake in the darkness of my own home and listen to the sounds that houses make, the settling of timbers, the creak of floorboards, the distant hum of wind against walls, and I wonder if somewhere in those sounds there might be a message. I wonder if the houses we live in might know more than we think, and I wonder what they might tell us. If only we learned to listen. The Crenshaws learned, and they never came back. In 1963, I received a letter from a man in Bangor who had read about my investigation in a local historical journal. He wrote that his grandfather had worked as a logger in Piscataquis County in the early 1900s, and that the older man had told him stories about a house in the forest that no one would approach. The details matched everything I had learned about old wood. But there was one element in his letter that I had not encountered before. His grandfather, he wrote, had once asked a Native American guide about the property. The guide, who was Penobscot and who had lived in the region all his life, had told him that the land was bad. Not dangerous in the way that cliffs or rapids were dangerous. Bad in a deeper sense, in a way that the guide's ancestors had understood and that his descendants had inherited. The guide said that there was something under that land, something that had been there before the first people came, something that was neither alive nor dead in any way that humans could understand. He said that the settlers who built on that land had made a mistake, and that the mistake could not be corrected. He said that whatever lived there fed on patience and silence. He said that it could wait for generations, and he said that it was always cold, no matter what the walls around it might suggest. The man who wrote to me asked if I believed the stories. I told him that I did not know what I believed, but I told him that there were some places in the world that seemed to operate by rules we do not understand, and that the house called Old Wood might have been one of them. He wrote back once more, thanking me for my response. And then he added something that I have never forgotten. He said that his grandfather, in his final years, had become increasingly reluctant to sleep. He would sit up through the night, listening, always listening, for sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. And when he finally died, in the winter of 1938, his last words were a warning. Do not go where the cold air breathes. I have honored that warning ever since. I have never returned to Piscataquis County. I have never sought out the site where Old Wood once stood, but sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I think about Cordelia Crenshaw sitting in her kitchen while her husband descended into the cellar. I think about the sound she heard rising up through the floorboards. I think about the conversation she could not quite understand, but that she knew somehow was being conducted on her behalf. And I think about her final entry in that journal, the entry where she wrote that she understood at last, that she had always been meant to understand, that the house had been waiting for her. I wonder what it would be like to find a place that was made for you, a place that knew your name before you knew it yourself. I wonder what it would be like to hear a voice in the darkness that spoke only to you, that offered only you its secrets. I wonder, and I am grateful that I will never know, because some invitations are not meant to be accepted, and some houses never stop calling for the ones they choose. The Crenshaw case was never closed, but it was in a sense completed. Whatever happened to Phineas and Cordelia in the winter of 1898-1899, it happened entirely. It happened thoroughly. They gave themselves to whatever lived in Old Wood, and Old Wood accepted them. Whether that acceptance was a blessing or a curse, I cannot say. I only know that on certain winter nights, when the temperature drops below zero and the wind goes still, there are people in that part of Maine who claim to hear sounds coming from the deep forest. Rhythmic sounds, patient sounds, sounds like tapping, like something talking to itself, waiting for someone new to listen.